Today I'm going to show you how to find your seams on a quilt that's been put together by somebody other than you. If you acquired a old antique quilt, it was put together by somebody else, maybe you inherited or something, and you've got half of a quilt that might have been sewed and the other half is unsewed, and you've got pieces of it and you don't know what seam allowances they was using on these, or maybe they was using multiple different seam allowances because they was doing it by hand, or they was cutting the blocks by hand and the pieces are not perfect. A lot of times people cut these by hand, or they sewed them on a sewing machine that had different seam allowance foots. The feet on the straight stitch on different machines was made differently, so you would have a different seam allowance going between these blocks. Now another thing is if you didn't cut them, or maybe you ironed them after you cut them, these blocks will stretch and they will change shapes over time. Sometimes they'll stretch wider, sometimes they'll stretch wider here. So what we're going to do is we're going to show you how to find the seams to sew one of these quilt tops and finish it. So you want to start wherever they left off at, and what you'll do is you'll match your blocks up. You'll come over here, you'll pull your block until it matches. You want to line the corners up, then you want to flip this block over, put it on top. Now once you put this block on top, you get the corners of it matched up with the corners on the one on the top, on the bottom, top and bottom, and you'll see right here's where your seam will need to be seamed. Then this seam and this seam will match up. Now you go to this one, do the same thing. Now this will give you almost identical seam, so that these corners will match every time when you put the rows together. Now if you don't do that, it's going to be a guessing game on how far to sew. Now I've seen some of these quilts, they'll be real wide here. You get to the next block here or down here and you'll have a real narrow gap because one of these blocks here was either short or one of these was long, and it'll stagger from seam to seam. Some will be long, some will be short. The seams will be wide, some will be short, narrow, and that is how you find the seams to finish putting a quilt back together. So if you find a box of quilts that's halfway put together and it was put together on a machine or by hand or some other way that you don't know, this is how you match your seams up. Some people would put these quilts together by hand. They would not know how to match the seams properly. They would put them halfway together and then they would run into errors because they didn't know how to match the seams. They'd get in a tough spot and they would abandon the project. This is how you'd pick up from someone else's project and correctly assemble the rows to putting the rest of the quilt together. This is how you would make all these corners right here come together. You'd start by the very outside block. You work it in from here, go on to the next one and the next one, and you would sew this direction until you got the whole row all the way across. Then you would butt it up to this lower row here, and then you would sew it, and each seam would come together perfectly like this right here. And this is how you would put together an old quilt that's been assembled by someone else on a different machine. This is how you could do it on another machine and bring it back to life and put it back together. This is the only way I know how to match it perfectly and make the corners come together when putting one back together. Now this is how you also learn in upholstery, because a lot of stuff will be sewn different ways on different machines by different methods. So when upholstering, this also applies to upholstery. As you lay your material out, you check the seam. So the seam would start right here. You would go down this row of flowers, and this would give you 2 blocks just like the lower blocks with the same seam. Then when you get to the underside, then you would fold these 2 together. Now one side will go one direction, one side will go another direction. And when you get to this point, it'll tell you which way. Once you sew up to about right here, this will tell you which direction these 2 will come together. Now you'll see right here, you can see there's a line here, a line there. When they're folded the right way, both of those folds will come perfectly together, and that's how you put the corners together in assembling upholstery or a quilt. And that's how you would do it if you was not the original sewer and you didn't have the original machine and you wasn't sewing it from scratch. You was picking up from someone else that had left off. This is how you would match it back up and make it come back out and finish an old project that had been abandoned. And that's the only way I know how of making all these seams come together. You want to make all the points come together where anything comes together and meets together. Now, this applies in upholstery when you're doing chair bottoms, seats, when you're having to sew chair bottoms. It also works in quilts. You get these perfect points. You want to see that in upholstery and you want to see it in quilts. So what time you're not doing upholstery, you may want to practice on some of these old quilts if you find them. If you find some that's been put together, or you might even want to start from scratch and just practice on your own. But this will help also in upholstery and quilt making. A lot of times this will help you get your skills up to matching up seams and stuff that's been sewn by somebody else, because people will bring you in projects that does not match. Your machine and your foot will not have the same seam allowance. And a lot of times this stuff was cut all different lengths, and over time, from where it's laid in boxes and been in attics, it's drawed moisture. The fabric will shrink or it will stretch out in certain spots. So this is the only way you can correct that. Now if you're making this from scratch and you're doing it yourself and you're cutting the blocks, it'll all line up the same and you won't have this kind of problem. But now if you're working from old and trying to relearn what somebody else was doing, this is the only way you're going to be able to do that. And that is how you put together an old project and reassemble it without having to keep sewing it, taking it apart, re-sewing it, taking it apart. This is the way to do it and sew it one time and make perfect